Welcome back to our channel. Dear viewers, before we dive into today's story, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from. Are you in New York? London? Maybe somewhere exotic like Bali or Dubai. I love connecting with our global family. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. Also, make sure to join our newsletter by clicking the link in the description. Our newsletter subscribers get access to exclusive inner circle stories that we don't share anywhere else. Stories that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. Now, let me tell you about a story that's going to shake you to your core. This isn't just about a wealthy wife humiliating her black maid. This is about pride that becomes poison, about the masks we wear in society, and about one moment of choice that revealed the true character of everyone involved. It's about a husband who had to choose between the woman he married and the principles that defined him as a man. What you're about to hear will make you angry. It will make you think. And by the end, it will make you question how you treat the people society tells you are beneath you, because sometimes the people we look down on are standing on higher ground than we ever imagined. The Whitmore mansion stood like a monument to success on Hillcrest Avenue, where every lawn was manicured to perfection, and every driveway gleamed with luxury cars that cost more than most people's homes. Behind its imposing gates lived Victoria Whitmore, a woman who had turned beauty and ambition into an art form. At 32, Victoria possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that stopped conversations in restaurants. Her platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and calculation, and her figure was maintained through rigorous personal training sessions and the finest cosmetic procedures money could buy. She wore her wealth like armor. Designer dresses that cost thousands, jewelry that caught light from across rooms, and shoes that clicked with authority against marble floors. But Victoria's true masterpiece wasn't her appearance. It was a carefully constructed world she had built around herself. Every detail of her life was curated for the admiration of others. The charity galas where photographers captured her generous smile, the social media posts showcasing her blessed life, the carefully chosen friends who enhanced her image, everything served the altar of her reputation. Mrs. Whitmore. Came a soft voice from behind her as she stood in her expansive living room, adjusting a crystal vase filled with imported orchids. "Would you like me to prepare your afternoon tea now?" Victoria didn't turn around. She never looked directly at Grace Williams, the woman who had worked in their home for the past 3 years. In Victoria's world, acknowledging service staff too personally was beneath her station. Grace was simply part of the furniture. Functional, necessary, but hardly worthy of genuine attention. Grace Williams was 45 years old, though life had aged her beyond her years. Her dark skin showed the evidence of long days and longer nights. Her hands bore the calluses of countless hours of cleaning, cooking, and maintaining the pristine world of Whitmore's inhabited. She was shorter than Victoria, more solidly built. With graying hair she kept pulled back in a simple bun. Her uniform, a modest gray dress with a white apron, was always impeccably clean, pressed with the same care she applied to everything in the Whitmore household. What Victoria failed to see, what she had trained herself not to see, was the intelligence that flickered behind Grace's dark eyes, the dignity that straightened her shoulders despite the weight of her circumstances, the gentle wisdom that came through in her careful words and thoughtful actions. "Just leave it on the kitchen counter," Victoria said dismissively, her attention focused on her reflection in the large mirror above the fireplace. "I'll take it when I'm ready." "Of course, ma'am." Grace's voice carried no resentment, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, that survival sometimes required swallowing pride like bitter medicine. From his study, Michael Whitmore observed this daily dance through a partially open door. At 38, Michael carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built his success through intelligence and determination rather than inheritance. His dark hair was touched with distinguished silver at the temples. His brown eyes were thoughtful and observant, and his presence commanded respect without demanding it. Michael had grown up in a middle-class family where respect was earned, not given based on bank account balances. His mother had cleaned houses to help pay for his education, and he had never forgotten the ache in her back at the end of long days, or the dignity she maintained despite the condescension she sometimes faced from employers. Watching his wife's interactions with Grace, or rather, her deliberate lack of interaction, stirred something uncomfortable in Michael's chest. It was a feeling that had been growing stronger over the past year, a sense that the woman he had fallen in love with was disappearing behind walls of pride and privilege. "Grace," Michael called out, stepping into the living room. "How is your grandson doing? The one who's applying to colleges." Grace's face lit up with a warmth that transformed her entire expression. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, thank you for asking. Marcus got accepted to 3 schools so far. He's hoping to study engineering, just like his grandfather dreamed of doing." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She hated when Michael engaged with the staff so personally. It blurred the lines she had worked so carefully to establish. "That's wonderful news." Michael smiled genuinely. "If he needs any letters of recommendation or advice about scholarship applications, please let me know. I'd be happy to help." "You're too kind, sir. Truly." Grace's eyes glistened with gratitude that she quickly blinked away. "I should get back to the kitchen now." As Grace disappeared from the room, Victoria whirled around to face her husband, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. "Michael, we've discussed this," she said in a low voice. "You don't need to get so involved with the help. It makes things complicated." "Complicated how, Victoria?" Michael's voice was calm, but his eyes searched her face with growing concern. "Grace has worked for us for 3 years. She's reliable, honest, and hardworking. What's complicated about treating her like a human being?" Victoria's green eyes flashed with something between anger and insecurity. "It's about maintaining appropriate boundaries. She's our employee, not our friend. When you blur those lines, it gives people the wrong ideas about their place." "Their place?" Michael repeated slowly, the words sitting heavy between them. "And what place is that exactly?" For a moment, Victoria faltered. The question hung in the air like an accusation, and she could see something shifting in her husband's expression, a coolness that hadn't been there before. "You know what I mean," she said finally, turning back to the mirror and smoothing her hair with shaking hands. "We have a certain position to maintain. People expect us to act with basic human decency," Michael interrupted, his voice gaining an edge Victoria rarely heard. "At least, the kind of people whose opinions should matter to us." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken tensions. Victoria felt something slipping away from her, something she couldn't quite name or catch. It was the first crack in the perfect world she had built, though she wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. In the kitchen, Grace went about her duties with practiced efficiency, but her mind wandered to the conversation she had just witnessed. She had become skilled at reading the undercurrents in the Whitmore household. The way Mrs. Whitmore's voice changed when she was feeling insecure, the way Mr. Whitmore's shoulders tensed when he was frustrated with his wife, the growing distance between them that they seemed to think no one else noticed. Grace had seen this pattern before in other homes where she had worked. Pride and privilege had a way of eating relationships from the inside out, creating walls between people who had once loved each other. She had learned not to get too attached to these families, knowing that their dramas would eventually touch everyone in their orbit. But there was something different about Mr. Whitmore. Despite his wealth and position, he carried himself with a humility that reminded her of her late husband, a man who had believed that character was measured not by what you had, but by how you treated those who had less. That evening, as Victoria prepared for yet another charity fundraiser, this one for children's literacy, though she had never actually read to a child in her life, she found herself studying her reflection with unusual intensity. The diamond necklace at her throat caught the light beautifully. Her makeup was flawless. Her gown hugged her figure perfectly. Everything about her appearance screamed success, sophistication, superiority. So why did she feel so empty? "You look beautiful," Michael said from behind her, but his voice lacked the warmth it used to carry when he complimented her. "Thank you," she replied automatically, not meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Will you be ready to leave in 15 minutes? "Actually, I think I'll stay home tonight. I have some work to catch up on." Victoria's hand stilled on her earring. Michael never missed social events. He understood the importance of being seen, of maintaining their image as the perfect power couple. But the Hendersons will be there. And the mayor. It's important that we're seen together. "Is it?" Michael asked quietly. "Important to whom?" Before Victoria could answer, Grace appeared in the doorway with a soft knock. "Mrs. Whitmore, your car is here." Victoria looked from her husband to Maid and felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. It was as if Grace's presence was a reminder of everything that was going wrong, everything that was shifting beneath Victoria's carefully constructed world. "Fine," she said to Michael, her voice brittle. "Stay home. But don't expect me to make excuses for your absence all night." As she swept past Grace without acknowledgement, Victoria missed a look of concern that passed between Michael and the maid, a moment of shared understanding about the woman. They both served in their different ways, and the tragedy of watching someone destroy themselves with their own pride. The front door closed with sound like finality, and the house settled into an unusual quiet. In the kitchen, Grace continued cleaning up from dinner. While in his study, Michael sat staring out the window at the manicured gardens, wondering when exactly his marriage had become a performance he no longer wanted to give. Neither of them could have predicted that within 24 hours, everything would change, that Victoria's need to maintain her position would lead her to a moment of public cruelty that would force Michael to choose between the woman he had married and the man he believed himself to be. The stage was set, the characters were in position, and the first act of tragedy was about to give way to a moment that would define them all. The next morning dawned gray and humid, the kind of day that seemed to press against windows and make everything feel claustrophobic. Victoria woke with a headache, partly from the champagne at last night's fundraiser, partly from the growing tension that seemed to follow her everywhere now. She had spent the evening explaining Michael's absence to curious friends, smiling through questions about whether everything was all right at home, deflecting concerns with practiced grace while inside she seethed with embarrassment. The Whitmores were supposed to be the golden couple, the ones everyone envied. Cracks in that facade were not acceptable. "Grace," she called out sharply as she descended the marble staircase in her silk robe, her voice echoing through the house. "Where's my usual morning coffee? And why are the newspapers still on the front step?" Grace appeared from the kitchen, moving with her characteristic quiet efficiency. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore asked me to prepare some documents for a business meeting, and I got a bit behind schedule. Your coffee will be ready in just 2 minutes." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Documents? What kind of documents?" "I'm not sure the details, ma'am. He just asked me to organize some files and have them ready for pickup." The seed of suspicion that had been planted the night before began to grow. Michael working with Grace on business matters? Asking her to handle confidential documents? The impropriety of it made Victoria's stomach clench with something she couldn't quite name, jealousy mixed with fear, wrapped in offended pride. "Where's my husband now?" she demanded. "He left early for the office, ma'am. He said he had back-to-back meetings all day and not to expect him for dinner." Another absence. Another crack in the perfect image Victoria worked so hard to maintain. She could already hear the whispered conversations among her social circle. "Have you noticed Michael isn't around much lately?" Victoria seems a bit on edge. "I wonder if everything is okay with their marriage." By noon, Victoria's mood had darkened considerably. She had spent the morning making calls, trying to arrange lunch with friends, only to find that everyone seemed to be busy. The house felt oppressive, and Grace's quiet presence moving through the rooms felt like a constant reminder of everything that was going wrong. It was then that Victoria decided to surprise Michael with lunch at his office, a gesture that she told herself was loving and supportive, but which was really driven by a need to reassert her position as the most important woman in his life. She selected her outfit carefully, a cream-colored designer dress that hugged her figure perfectly, paired with heels that added 3 inches to her height and jewelry that caught the light with every movement. If she was going to make an appearance at Michael's prestigious law firm, she was going to remind everyone exactly who Victoria Whitmore was. The drive downtown took 30 minutes through traffic, and Victoria spent every minute rehearsing how the surprise would unfold. Michael would be pleased to see her. His colleagues would be reminded of what an enviable wife he had, and perhaps they could salvage something from this increasingly difficult day. But as she pulled into the parking garage of Michael's building, her carefully planned scenario began to unravel. There, sitting in Michael's distinctive black Mercedes, was Grace. Victoria's hands tightened on her steering wheel as she processed what she was seeing. Grace was in the back seat, like hired help might be expected to sit. She was in the front passenger seat, looking comfortable and at ease, as if she belonged there. The rational part of Victoria's mind, the part that was rapidly being overwhelmed by emotion, knew there had to be an innocent explanation. Grace had mentioned organizing documents for Michael. Perhaps he had asked her to deliver them. Perhaps this was simply efficient business management. But Victoria was far past rational thinking. The sight of another woman in her husband's car, looking so relaxed and natural, triggered every insecurity she had been fighting to suppress. Here was Grace, the maid, a woman Victoria barely acknowledged, sitting in the place where Victoria herself usually sat, in the car Victoria had helped choose, surrounded by the luxury Victoria's social status had provided. The injustice of it, the absolute audacity, sent a surge of rage through Victoria's body that was so intense it left her shaking. She parked her car and walked across the garage with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the concrete like gunshots. Through the Mercedes windows, she could see Grace checking her phone, completely unaware of the storm approaching. Victoria yanked open the passenger door with such force that Grace jumped, her phone clattering to the floor of the car. What? Victoria said, her voice low and dangerous. Do you think you're doing? Grace looked up with startled eyes, immediately recognizing the fury in her employer's face. Mrs. Whitmore, I was just... Get out of my husband's car. Now! Grace's training in conflict avoidance kicked in immediately. Of course, ma'am. I was just waiting to... I said, get out. Victoria's voice had risen to a shout that echoed through the parking garage, drawing the attention of several other people walking to their cars. Grace moved to exit the vehicle, but her natural dignity prevented her from scrambling out in panic. She gathered her purse calmly and stepped out of the car with the same quiet grace she brought to everything she did, but her composure only infuriated Victoria more. How dare this woman, this employee, this maid, remain so calm when Victoria was falling apart? How dare she act with such dignity when Victoria felt like she was losing control of everything in her life? You're just a maid. Victoria screamed, her voice carrying across the parking garage and causing several people to stop and stare. You clean toilets and dust furniture. How dare you sit in my husband's car like you have some right to be there? How dare you think you can take my place? Grace stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Victoria's shoulder. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, the only safe response was quiet endurance. Know your place, Victoria continued, her voice growing more shrill with each word. You work for us. You are nothing. You are nobody. And if you think for 1 second that you can come between me and my husband, you are more deluded than I thought. A small crowd had gathered now, people emerging from the elevator and nearby cars, drawn by the commotion. Some held phones. Others simply stared in shocked silence. Victoria was too consumed by her rage to notice or care about their audience. Grace finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Whitmore asked me to... I don't care what he asked you to do. Victoria interrupted, stepping closer to Grace in a way that felt threatening. You have forgotten your place, and I am here to remind you. You are hired help. You are replaceable. You mean nothing to this family, nothing to my husband, and nothing to anyone who matters. The cruelty in Victoria's words hung in the air like poison. Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a disturbing scene. Grace's composure finally began to crack, not from anger but from deep, bone-tired sadness. She had endured this kind of humiliation before in different forms, but it never got easier. The reduction of her entire existence to her economic function, the denial of her humanity, the assumption that her circumstances made her less valuable as a person, it was a wound that never fully healed. I understand, ma'am, she said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears. I apologize if I overstepped. And that was when Michael arrived. He had been walking across the parking garage from the building entrance, returning from a client lunch, when he heard his wife's voice raise in anger. His first thought was that she might be in trouble, might need help, and he quickened his pace. But as he got closer and the words became clear, his blood turned cold. He rounded the corner just in time to see his wife standing over Grace, her face twisted with rage that made her beautiful features look ugly and cruel. He heard the tail end of her verbal assault, saw the way Grace stood with quiet dignity, despite the humiliation being heaped upon her, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Victoria. His voice cut across the parking garage like a blade, sharp enough to silence his wife immediately. Victoria spun around, her face flushed with exertion and anger. For a moment, she felt a surge of relief. Finally, Michael was here to support her, to put Grace back in her place, to restore the natural order of things. Michael, thank God, she began, her voice still shaky with emotion. I found her sitting in your car like she owned it, and I was just explaining to her that there are boundaries. Stop talking. Michael's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Victoria's words die in her throat. He looked at Grace, who was still standing with her head bowed, her hands trembling slightly. Then he looked at the crowd of onlookers, some of whom he recognized as colleagues and clients from his firm. Then he looked back at his wife, and Victoria saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, not just disappointment, but disgust. Grace, he said gently, I asked you to wait in my car because I knew you had to get back home to pick up your grandson from school. I gave you my car keys and told you to wait in comfort rather than standing in the heat. Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The innocent explanation she had refused to consider, the rational context she had been too blinded by jealousy to see, hit her like a physical blow. Grace has been helping me organize documents for a pro bono case I'm working on, Michael continued, his voice growing harder with each word. A case involving discrimination and workplace harassment, the irony of which is apparently lost on you. The crowd had grown larger, and Victoria became suddenly horribly aware of how this must look. Her public humiliation of their domestic worker, her screaming about knowing one's place, her reduction of human being to her economic function, all of it captured on phones, witnessed by people who knew them, who had spread the story through their social circles like wildfire. "Michael," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what, Victoria?" His voice was ice cold now. "You thought that Grace was somehow trying to seduce me? You thought that a woman who has worked for us faithfully for 3 years suddenly decided to overstep her bounds? Or did you just see a black woman sitting in a car and assume she must be doing something wrong?" The last question hit Victoria like a slap. The ugly truth behind her assumptions, the prejudices she had never examined or acknowledged, were suddenly laid bare for everyone to see, including herself. Around them, phones continued to record, capturing every moment of Victoria's public reckoning. By tomorrow, this scene would be shared across social media, dissected in group chats, and discussed in the very social circles where Victoria had worked so hard to maintain her perfect image. But worse than the public humiliation was the look in her husband's eyes, the complete loss of respect, the recognition of who she really was beneath the designer clothes and charity galas and carefully curated social media posts. Michael turned to Grace, his voice gentle in a way it hadn't been when addressing his wife. "Grace, please take my car and go pick up Marcus. Take the rest of the day off. Paid, of course." Grace nodded silently, her dignity intact despite everything she had endured. As she moved toward the driver's side of the car, Victoria watched in mounting horror as her husband, her own husband, helped the maid into the vehicle with the same courtesy he might show an honored guest. "Michael, please," Victoria whispered as the car pulled away. "Can we just go inside and talk about this privately?" Michael looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw her entire world reflected in his disappointed gaze. Not just her marriage, but her identity, her place in society, everything she had built her life around. "No, Victoria," he said quietly. "I don't think we can." He turned and walked toward the building, leaving her standing alone in the parking garage, surrounded by strangers with cameras and the wreckage of the perfect life she had worked so hard to create. For the first time in years, Victoria Whitmore had no idea what to do next. What would you do if you were in Michael's position? Would you defend your wife or stand up for what's right, even if it meant destroying your marriage? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free and helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. Also, don't forget to join our newsletter in the description for exclusive Inner Circle stories that dive even deeper into the psychology of human behavior. Now, let's see what happens when Victoria realizes that her moment of cruelty has consequences she never imagined. The Whitmore mansion had never felt so empty. Victoria sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by all the beautiful things that had once made her feel powerful and secure, but now they seemed to mock her with their cold perfection. The crystal vase she had been adjusting just yesterday, was it only yesterday? Caught the afternoon light, casting fractured rainbows across the marble floor like broken promises. It had been 4 hours since the parking garage incident, 4 hours since her world had tilted off its axis and sent her tumbling into a reality she didn't recognize. The drive home had been a blur of tears and rage, her hands shaking so badly she had nearly rear-ended another car at a red light. Now she waited. Michael would come home eventually, and when he did, she would explain. She would make him understand that she had been protecting their marriage, their reputation, their carefully constructed life. Surely he would see that her reaction, while perhaps excessive, came from a place of love and concern for their relationship. The front door opened at exactly 6:47 p.m. Victoria had been watching the clock obsessively. She heard Michael's footsteps in the foyer, the familiar sound of his briefcase being set down, his keys hitting the crystal bowl on the entry table. Normal sounds from a normal evening, except nothing about this evening was normal. "Michael?" she called out, her voice carefully modulated to sound calm and reasonable. "Could you come in here, please? I think we need to talk." The footsteps paused. For a moment, Victoria thought he might ignore her, might walk straight upstairs or to the study, leaving her alone with the growing panic in her chest. But then the steps resumed, and Michael appeared in the doorway of the living room. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked aged, as if the events of the afternoon had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. He was still wearing his business suit, but his tie was loose, his usually perfect posture slightly slumped. When he looked at her, Victoria saw none of the warmth, none of the affection that had always been there, even during their worst arguments. "What would you like to talk about, Victoria?" His voice was polite, distant, the tone he might use with a client he didn't particularly like. Victoria had rehearsed this conversation during the long afternoon hours, but now, faced with a stranger who used to be her husband, her carefully planned words evaporated. "I want to explain what happened today," she began, rising from the sofa and smoothing her dress. "I know it looked bad, but if you just let me explain my perspective—" "Your perspective." Michael repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. "And what perspective would that be, Victoria?" "I was protecting our marriage." The words burst out of her with more force than she had intended. "I came to surprise you with lunch, to do something loving and romantic, and I found another woman sitting in your car like she belonged there. What was I supposed to think?" Michael walked into the room, but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood with his hands in his pockets, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "You were supposed to think," he said quietly, "that there might be an innocent explanation. You were supposed to give Grace and me the benefit of the doubt. You were supposed to act like the intelligent, reasonable person I married. Don't turn this around on me." Victoria's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "You've been different lately, distant, and suddenly you're asking the maid to handle your business documents? You're giving her rides in your car? How am I supposed to interpret that?" "As kindness," Michael said, and the simplicity of the word hit Victoria like a blow. "As basic human decency towards someone who works hard and deserves to be treated with respect." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, the same vertigo she had experienced in the parking garage. "But she's just—" "Just what, Victoria?" Michael's voice sharpened. "Just what?" Victoria opened her mouth to say, "Just a maid," but something in her husband's eyes stopped her. The disgust she had seen earlier was back, waiting for her to confirm his worst suspicions about who she really was. "She's our employee," Victoria said instead, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "Her name is Grace Williams," Michael said, moving to the window and staring out at their manicured gardens. "She's 45 years old. She has a grandson named Marcus who wants to study engineering. She lost her husband in a construction accident 7 years ago and has been supporting her daughter and grandson ever since. She works 3 jobs, ours, a weekend cleaning service, and evening alterations for a tailor shop." Each detail hit Victoria like a separate accusation. She realized that in 3 years, she had never asked Grace about her family, her dreams, her life beyond the walls of the Whitmore mansion. "She sends half her paycheck back to her mother in Alabama, who has diabetes and can't afford her medications," Michael continued, his voice growing softer but somehow more devastating. "She's never missed a day of work for us, never complained, never asked for special favors. And today, when I asked her to help me with documents for a discrimination case, a case I'm handling pro bono because I believe people deserve to be treated fairly regardless of their race or social status, she organized everything perfectly and was waiting in my car because I told her to." Victoria sank back onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The Grace that Michael was describing was an invisible figure who had moved through their house for 3 years. She was a real person with real struggles, real dreams, real dignity that Victoria had never bothered to see. "I didn't know," she whispered. "You didn't want to know," Michael corrected, turning back to face her. "There's a difference, Victoria. You chose not to see Grace as a human being because it was easier to think of her as just part of the household machinery." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, marking time that felt precious and finite in a way it never had before. "Michael," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain, "I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I reacted badly. But surely you can understand why I was upset. Finding another woman in your car, not knowing what was going on." "Another woman?" Michael's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that really how you see this? As some kind of romantic threat?" Victoria's silence was answer enough. Michael walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of disappointment that made Victoria's chest ache. "Do you know what I was doing when I was 12 years old, Victoria?" he asked without turning around. "I was watching my mother come home every day, exhausted from cleaning houses for families like ours. Rich families who treated her like she was invisible, who spoke about her like she wasn't in the room, who never once asked about her dreams or her struggles or her life outside their mansions. Victoria had heard fragments of Michael's childhood before, but he had never spoken about it with such raw emotion. I watched her bite her tongue when employers blamed her for things she didn't do. I watched her smile politely when they criticized her work, her appearance, her accent. I watched her count every dollar, because the difference between $20 and $25 could mean whether or not I got new shoes for school. He turned around then, and Victoria saw tears in his eyes, something she hadn't seen since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. And I promised myself that when I grew up, when I had money and power and influence, I would never treat another human being the way my mother was treated. I would never reduce someone's worth to their economic function. I would never make someone feel small because of the work they did to survive. The weight of his words settled over Victoria like a heavy blanket. She began to understand that this wasn't just about her jealousy or her public outburst. This was about fundamental values, about the kind of people they were and wanted to be. Today, Michael continued, I watched the woman I married become everything I promised myself I would stand against. I watched you reduce Grace to nothing more than her job title. I watched you humiliate a woman who has never shown you anything but respect and professional courtesy. And I realized that somewhere along the way, you became someone I don't recognize. Victoria felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying now would seem manipulative, would make this about her pain rather than the damage she had caused. It doesn't have to be this way, she said desperately. I can change. I can apologize to Grace, treat her better. Can you? Michael asked, and the question wasn't rhetorical. Can you really see Grace as your equal, Victoria? Can you treat her with the respect and kindness you show to your wealthy friends? Or will you always see her as someone beneath you, someone whose feelings matter less than your convenience? Victoria opened her mouth to insist that she could change, that she would be different, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she wasn't sure she could see Grace as an equal. The social conditioning, the class consciousness, the unconscious prejudices that had shaped her worldview for 32 years. Could those really be undone by good intentions and guilt? The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things Victoria couldn't say and all the things Michael didn't need to hear. I need some air, Michael said finally. I'm going for a walk. How long will you be gone? Victoria asked, hating how small and frightened her voice sounded. Michael paused at the doorway. I don't know. After he left, Victoria sat alone in the living room as the shadows lengthened and the house grew dark around her. For the first time in years, she didn't turn on the lights, didn't move to just the perfect arrangements of furniture and flowers. She simply sat in the growing darkness and tried to understand how her perfect life had begun to unravel so completely. Upstairs in the guest room that had been prepared but never used, Grace's few personal belongings sat in a small bag by the door. She had returned from picking up Marcus to find a note from Michael asking her to take a few days off, with full pay, while things settled down. The kindness of the gesture had almost broken her composure entirely. But Grace Williams had survived worse storms than this one. She had buried a husband, raised a daughter as a single mother, worked multiple jobs while earning her GED, and maintained her dignity through countless small humiliations and major injustices. As she lay in her small apartment across town, listening to Marcus practice his valedictorian speech for graduation, Grace felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Hope. Not hope that Mrs. Whitmore would change. Grace had seen too much of the world to believe in miraculous transformations of character. But hope that Mr. Whitmore's kindness was real. His defense of her dignity meant something. That perhaps the world was slowly becoming a place where people like her grandson might face fewer battles than she had. Meanwhile, Michael walked through the expensive neighborhood where he lived, past houses that looked like monuments to success and prosperity, and wondered when exactly he had lost sight of values that had shaped him. When had he become complicit in a system that treated people like Grace as invisible? When had he started prioritizing his wife's comfort over basic human decency? The cool evening air cleared his head, but not his conscience. Tomorrow, he would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be going forward. Tonight, he would have to decide what kind of marriage he was willing to accept. As the night deepened over the divided house, 3 people lay awake in different places, each grappling with the aftermath of a moment that had revealed truths they might prefer to keep hidden. The weight of those revelations would only grow heavier in the days to come. The next morning arrived gray and sullen, matching the mood that had settled over everyone touched by yesterday's events. Victoria woke from a restless sleep to find Michael's side of the bed untouched. He had spent the night in his study, a symbolic distance that felt like an ocean between them. She found him in the kitchen, making coffee with mechanical precision, his face drawn and exhausted. The sight of him performing such a mundane domestic task, something Grace usually handled, sent a sharp pang through Victoria's chest. "Michael," she began softly, "we need to talk about what happens next." "What happens next," Michael said without looking at her, "is that we figure out how to make this right." "Make it right how?" Victoria asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "We start by understanding who Grace really is," Michael said, finally meeting her eyes. "Not the convenient fiction you created in your mind, but the actual person who's been working in our home for 3 years." Over the next hour, Michael shared what he had learned about Grace Williams through the professional interaction and the simple act of treating her like a human being worthy of conversation. But there was much more to the story, details that would fundamentally change how Victoria saw not just Grace, but herself. Grace Williams had been born in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1978, the youngest of 4 children in a family where love was abundant but money was scarce. Her father had worked double shifts at a steel mill until his lungs gave out when Grace was 16. Her mother had cleaned houses and taken in laundry, much like Michael's mother had done, sacrificing her own dreams so her children might have a chance at something better. Grace had been the first in her family to graduate high school, earning grades that could have taken her to college if there had been money for tuition. Instead, she had married young, to James Williams, a kind man who worked construction, and shared her dream of building a better life for the family they planned to have. For 10 years, Grace and James had worked toward their goals with quiet determination. She had earned her GED while working as a hotel housekeeper, and he had saved every extra dollar towards starting his own contracting business. They had bought a small house, planted a garden, and welcomed Grace's daughter, Sarah, when she was 28. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it was filled with the kind of love and purpose that money couldn't buy. James would come home covered in dust and paint, sweep Grace into his arms, and dance with her in their tiny kitchen, while Sarah giggled from her high chair. On Sundays, they would pack picnic lunches and spend the day at the park, making plans for the addition they would build onto their house, the college fund they were slowly accumulating for Sarah, the small contracting business that would eventually provide stability and independence. But dreams, Grace had learned, were fragile things. James Williams died on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 years ago. A crane malfunction at a construction site, a preventable accident caused by equipment that hadn't been properly maintained because the developer was cutting costs to maximize profit. The settlement was enough to cover funeral expenses and little else. The small contracting business existed only in business plans and dreams. Suddenly, Grace was a 38-year-old widow with a 12-year-old daughter and no clear path forward. The hotel job barely covered rent on their small house, and Sarah needed things: school clothes, books, medical checkups, and most importantly, hope for a future that extended beyond the cycle of poverty that had claimed so many in their community. That's when Grace had made the decision that would reshape her entire life. She would move north, where wages were higher and opportunities more plentiful. She would work whatever jobs necessary to give Sarah the chance at college that Grace herself had never had. The transition had been brutal, leaving behind a community that had supported her through James's death, selling the little house with its garden and memories, moving to a city where she knew no one. It had taken every ounce of strength Grace possessed. Her first job in a new city was at a hotel downtown, the kind of place where business travelers and tourists slept on Egyptian cotton sheets and never thought about the women who changed those sheets each day. Grace worked the early shift, 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., which allowed her to be home when Sarah got out of school. But one job wasn't enough. Even with the higher wages, the cost of living in the city ate through Grace's paycheck with frightening speed. So she added a second job, cleaning offices in the evenings after the white-collar workers had gone home to their suburban houses and their comfortable lives. Still not enough. Sarah was bright, brilliant, actually, and Grace could see that with the right opportunities, her daughter could become anything she wanted to be. But those opportunities required money for advanced classes, college preparation courses, eventually university tuition. So Grace added a third job, weekend house cleaning for wealthy families who wanted their homes to be spotless, but didn't want to think about the labor required to maintain that spotlessness. That's how she had come to work for the Whitmores 3 years ago. The agency had described them as a lovely professional couple with high standards but fair treatment of staff. The pay was good, the house was beautiful, and Mrs. Whitmore seemed pleasant enough during the brief interview. What the agency hadn't mentioned, what Grace had learned through 3 years of careful observation, was that Mrs. Whitmore had perfected the art of making domestic workers feel invisible, not through overt cruelty, but through a systematic denial of their humanity that was in some ways more devastating than outright hostility. Grace had worked for genuinely awful people before. Employers who screamed over minor imperfections, who accused her of theft, who made inappropriate comments about her appearance or her race. But Victoria Whitmore's brand of cruelty was more subtle and perhaps more damaging. She simply acted as if Grace didn't exist as a person, only as a function. In 3 years, Victoria had never asked Grace about her family, her background, her life outside the Whitmore household. She never said please or thank you. She never acknowledged birthdays or holidays with so much as a card. She spoke about Grace to others as if Grace were in the room, discussing her work performance, her appearance, her perceived shortcomings as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment rather than a human being. But Grace had endured it because the job paid well and the hours were manageable, allowing her to maintain her other employment while still being present for Sarah during the crucial teenage years. She had endured it because Sarah was thriving in her new school, earning grades that would open doors to scholarships and opportunities. She had endured it because the alternative, moving back to Alabama with fewer prospects and less money, would mean abandoning the future she was building for her daughter. What Victoria had never understood was that Grace's quiet dignity wasn't submission. It was strength. The strength to swallow pride when necessary while never losing sight of her own worth. The strength to remain professional and courteous in the face of daily indignities. The strength to work 3 jobs while raising a teenager, managing a household, and still finding energy to help her grandson with his homework when Sarah was at her evening classes. Because Sarah Williams had not only survived the transition to city life, she had flourished. Now 22, she was in her final year of nursing school, maintaining a perfect GPA while working part-time at a community health clinic. She had inherited her mother's quiet strength and her father's gentle humor, along with an intelligence that impressed the professors and a compassion that drew people to her like a magnet. And Marcus, Sarah's son, Grace's grandson, was the bright star that made every sacrifice worthwhile. At 17, he was already being recruited by colleges for both his academic achievements and his leadership in community service projects. The boy who had started school in Alabama speaking with a thick accent and wearing second-hand clothes was now the senior class president, captain of the debate team, and recipient of 3 scholarship offers. It was Marcus who had inadvertently triggered yesterday's confrontation. Grace had been helping Michael organize documents for a pro bono case when Marcus called, excited about news from another college. In her moment of happiness and pride, Grace had shared the news with Michael, who had immediately offered to write a letter of recommendation and had insisted on giving Grace time off to attend Marcus's college interviews. "Let me drive you to the parking garage," Michael had said. "You can wait in my car while I grab some additional files from my office, and then you can take the car and pick up Marcus early from school." Consider it a small celebration of his achievements. Such a simple act of kindness, such basic human decency extended to someone who had never asked for special treatment but had earned it through 3 years of dedicated service. And it had triggered Victoria's meltdown because she couldn't conceive of Grace as someone worthy of consideration, someone whose family milestones mattered, someone who deserved to be treated with basic respect. As Michael finished sharing what he knew of Grace's story, Victoria sat in stunned silence. She was beginning to understand that the woman she had screamed at in the parking garage wasn't just a maid. She was someone who had overcome more challenges and shown more genuine strength than Victoria had ever faced in her privileged life. "She never told me any of this," Victoria whispered. "You never asked," Michael replied simply. "In 3 years, Victoria, you never once asked Grace about her life outside this house. You never showed the slightest interest in her as a person." Victoria felt something crumbling inside her chest. Not just her marriage, but her entire sense of who she was. She had prided herself on being a good person, a charitable person. She donated to worthy causes, attended fundraisers for disadvantaged children, even volunteered occasionally at community events. But she had never extended basic human courtesy to the woman who cleaned her toilets and folded her laundry. "What kind of person does that make me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Michael looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Pity. "That," he said quietly, "is something you're going to have to figure out for yourself." The phone rang then, sharp and insistent in the heavy silence. Michael answered it, and Victoria watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "Yes, I understand," he said finally. "We'll be right there." He hung up and turned to Victoria with an expression she couldn't read. "That was the hospital," he said. Grace is in the emergency room. Marcus was in a car accident on his way to school this morning. Grace collapsed when she got the news. Victoria felt the world tilt again, but this time it wasn't about her own problems or her own pain. For the first time in 3 years, perhaps the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself genuinely worried about Grace Williams as a human being, not just as an employee or a symbol of her own failures. "Is he?" she began. "He's alive," Michael said, already reaching for his keys. But Grace is alone at the hospital, and she doesn't have anyone else to call. The implication hung in the air between them. Grace Williams, who had worked 3 jobs to support her family, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter and grandson, who had endured daily humiliations with quiet dignity, was facing the worst nightmare of her life with no one beside her. "We have to go," Victoria said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Michael looked at her sharply. "We?" "Yes," Victoria said, standing up with more determination than she had felt in months. "We have to go. Right now." It wasn't redemption. Victoria understood that much. One gesture of decency couldn't undo 3 years of casual cruelty, couldn't erase the public humiliation she had inflicted, couldn't repair the damage her prejudices had caused. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, Grace knew from hard experience, that was all you could ask for: the chance to begin again, to be better than you had been before, to choose compassion over comfort and humanity over pride. This story is really making me think about how we treat the people who serve us every day, the house cleaners, the restaurant workers, the grocery store clerks. Before we continue to the final act, take a moment and think about your own life. How do you treat the people society considers beneath your social status? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. These stories take hours to research and craft, and your subscription really helps us keep bringing you content that makes you think. Also, join our newsletter for exclusive Inner Circle stories that dive even deeper into the psychology of human relationships. Now, let's see how this powerful story concludes. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, a combination that hit Victoria the moment the automatic door slid open. She had been in hospitals before, for charity photo opportunities, ribbon cuttings for new wings funded by wealthy donors, carefully orchestrated visits that lasted just long enough for the cameras to capture her compassionate smile. But she had never been in a hospital like this, walking quickly down fluorescent-lit corridors toward a waiting room where real human suffering was unfolding, where someone she knew was facing the kind of terror that no amount of money could fix. Michael walked beside her in grim silence, his long strides forcing Victoria to hurry to keep up. They had barely spoken during the 20-minute drive, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find when they arrived. The emergency waiting room was a symphony of quiet desperation, hushed conversations, muffled sobs, the squeak of wheelchairs, and the soft-soled footsteps of medical staff. Victoria's designer heels clicked against the linoleum floor, drawing unwanted attention in a space where everyone else seemed to understand the unspoken rules of hospital conduct. They found Grace in the far corner of the waiting room, sitting alone in a plastic chair that seemed to swallow her small frame. She was still wearing her cleaning uniform from her morning job at the hotel, her hands clutched around a tissue that had been twisted into unrecognizable shreds. When she looked up at their approach, Victoria saw something that stopped her cold. Not just fear or sadness, but a kind of raw vulnerability that made Grace look decades younger and infinitely more fragile. "Mr. Whitmore," Grace said, starting to rise from her chair. Even in crisis, even in the worst moment of her life, her first instinct was to show deference to her employers. "Grace, please don't get up," Michael said quickly, settling into the chair beside her. "How is Marcus? What are the doctors saying?" Victoria stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of her place in this tableau of genuine human concern. She wasn't used to situations where her wealth and social position were irrelevant, where the normal rules of interaction didn't apply. Finally, she took the chair across from Grace, her movements uncertain and uncharacteristically hesitant. "He's in surgery," Grace said, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. The other driver ran a red light and hit Marcus's car on the passenger side. "He has internal bleeding, and they're not sure. They can't tell me if—" She broke off, unable to voice her worst fears. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Victoria found herself studying Grace's face, really looking at her for perhaps the first time in 3 years. Without the protective distance of employer-employee roles, without the barriers Victoria had constructed to keep Grace at arm's length, she could see the woman clearly. The intelligence in her eyes, the strength that set her jaw, the love that radiated from every gesture as she spoke about her grandson. Sarah's driving up from school, Grace continued, her voice stronger now. She should be here in about an hour. I tried to call my mother, but she doesn't handle these things well since her stroke last year, so I don't want to worry her until... Until you know more, Michael finished gently. That's wise. Is there anything we can do? Anyone else we should call? Grace shook her head. There's no one else. It's just us, me and Sarah and Marcus. We've always been enough for each other, but right now... She gestured helplessly at the sterile hospital environment, at the closed doors behind which her grandson's life hung in the balance. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't immediately identify. It was a recognition that Grace's family, this small unit of 3 people who loved each other fiercely, was more genuine and connected than the elaborate social network Victoria had spent years cultivating. Grace's relationships were built on sacrifice and devotion, while Victoria's were constructed around mutual benefit and social advantage. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace said suddenly, seeming to notice Victoria for the first time. I want to apologize for yesterday. I never meant to cause trouble between you and Mr. Whitmore. I should have been more careful about boundaries. The apology hit Victoria like a physical blow. Here was Grace, facing the worst crisis of her life, taking responsibility for Victoria's jealousy and prejudice. The Grace. And Victoria couldn't help but notice the appropriateness of the name, with which this woman was handling herself, even now made Victoria feel smaller and more ashamed than she had ever felt in her life. Grace, Victoria began, her voice unsteady. You don't need to apologize. You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. I'm the one who should... Mrs. Williams? A doctor in green scrubs appeared at Grace's side, his expression serious but not grave. Grace shot to her feet, so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. Yes, that's me. How is Marcus? Please tell me he's okay. The surgery went well, the doctor said, and Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief. We were able to repair the internal damage, and while he has several broken ribs and concussion, he's going to be fine. He's young and strong, and he should make a full recovery. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face openly now. Thank God. Thank God. Can I see him? He's in recovery now, but you should be able to see him in about an hour. He's going to be groggy from the anesthesia, but he's stable. After the doctor left, Grace sank back into her chair, her entire body shaking with relief and residual adrenaline. Michael reached over and squeezed her hand gently, a gesture of comfort that Victoria noticed with a complex mix of emotions. He's okay, Grace whispered, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. My baby is okay. Victoria watched this display of raw emotion, this moment of pure maternal love and relief, and felt something crack open inside her. For 3 years, she had reduced Grace to a job function, never considering that this woman loved her family with the same fierce intensity Victoria felt for what? What did Victoria love with that kind of passion? Her social position? Her image? Her possessions? The waiting room doors burst open, and a young woman rushed in, her dark hair disheveled and her nursing scrubs wrinkled from the long drive. Sarah Williams was clearly her mother's daughter. She had Grace's same determined stride, the same intelligent eyes, the same quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within. Mama, Sarah called out, and Grace stood to embrace her daughter with a force that spoke of years of mutual support and unconditional love. He's okay, baby, Grace said, holding Sarah tight. The surgery went well. He's going to be fine. Victoria watched this reunion and felt like an intruder in a moment of private intimacy. But she also felt something else, a longing for the kind of authentic connection she was witnessing. The kind of relationship built on shared struggles and genuine care rather than social obligations and mutual benefit. Sarah, Michael said when the initial emotion had subsided, I'm Michael Whitmore, your mother's employer, and this is my wife, Victoria. Sarah turned to look at them both, her expression polite but wary. Victoria realized that Sarah had undoubtedly heard about yesterday's incident. News of that kind of public humiliation traveled fast in small communities. Thank you for coming, Sarah said carefully. It means a lot to my mother to have support right now. The words were courteous, but Victoria could hear the subtext. After what you did to my mother yesterday, I'm surprised you have a nerve to show your face here. An hour later, when Grace was finally allowed to see Marcus, Victoria found herself alone with Sarah in the waiting room, while Michael went to get coffee. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken tensions. Your mother is a remarkable woman, Victoria said finally, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. Sarah looked at her with surprise and a hint of skepticism. Yes, she is. I want you to know that what happened yesterday, It was inexcusable. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. Sarah studied Victoria's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the apology was genuine or merely a social courtesy. My mother has worked for a lot of families over the years, Sarah said finally. Rich families who treated her like she was invisible, like her feelings didn't matter, like her life outside their houses wasn't worth considering. She's never complained, never said a harsh word about any of them, even the ones who were cruel to her. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, knowing she belonged in that category of employers. But yesterday, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, yesterday you didn't just treat her badly. You humiliated her in public, screamed at her like she was less than human, made her feel ashamed of work that she does with pride and dignity. Do you have any idea what that did to her? I'm beginning to understand, Victoria said quietly. Are you? Sarah's voice was sharp now. Because my mother came home yesterday and cried for the first time since my father's funeral. Not just because of what you said, but because she thought she had somehow failed, somehow done something wrong to deserve that treatment. A woman who has sacrificed everything for her family, who works 3 jobs to put me through nursing school and help Marcus get to college. Spent the evening wondering if she was somehow at fault for your jealousy and prejudice. Each word hit Victoria like a physical blow, stripping away the rationalizations and excuses she had been constructing since yesterday. She saw clearly now the full impact of her actions. Not just the public spectacle, but the private pain she had inflicted on someone who had done nothing but serve her family faithfully. Sarah, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper, how do I make this right? How do I even begin to apologize for something like this? Sarah looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw Grace's wisdom reflected in her daughter's eyes. You start, Sarah said, by understanding that my mother isn't just a maid. She's Grace Williams. She's a woman who lost the love of her life and rebuilt her entire existence around giving her family a better future. She's someone who remembers every birthday, who never misses a day of work, who treats your home with more care than some people treat their own families. Victoria nodded, tears beginning to blur her vision. And then, Sarah continued, you decide what kind of person you want to be going forward. Because this isn't just about one bad day or one public outburst. This is about 3 years of treating my mother like she wasn't worth your basic courtesy. This is about a pattern of behavior that reveals who you really are when you think no one important is watching. Before Victoria could respond, Grace returned from Marcus's room, her face glowing with relief and maternal pride. He's awake, she announced to the room. Groggy, but awake and asking for his college acceptance letters. Can you believe it? The boy nearly dies in a car accident, and he's worried about his scholarship applications. The love in her voice was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Victoria felt another piece of her carefully constructed worldview crumble away. This woman had more reason to be proud of her family than Victoria had ever had to be proud of anything in her life. Michael returned with coffee and the news that Marcus was asking to see his grandmother. As Grace prepared to return to her grandson's room, she paused and looked directly at Victoria for the first time since their arrival. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Thank you for coming today. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone, and I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges. Life is too short and too precious to carry anger in your heart. The magnanimity of the statement, the fact that Grace was offering forgiveness when Victoria hadn't even properly asked for it, left Victoria speechless. She watched Grace walk away with the same dignity she had maintained throughout 3 years of casual dismissal and public humiliation, and realized she was witnessing something rare and beautiful, a human being who had chosen to respond to cruelty with grace, to hatred with love, to prejudice with understanding. She's extraordinary, Victoria whispered to Michael. Yes, he replied, but his voice was distant, thoughtful. She is. They drove home in contemplative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. It wasn't until they were back in their pristine living room, surrounded by the beautiful objects that had once seemed so important, that Victoria finally found the courage to voice what had been building in her heart all day. Michael, she said, I want to make this right, not just with an apology, but with real change. I want to be better than I've been. Michael looked at her carefully, and Victoria could see him weighing her words, trying to determine if they represented genuine transformation or merely temporary guilt. What does that look like, Victoria? He asked. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I know it starts with seeing Grace, really seeing her as the remarkable woman she is. And it continues with examining every assumption I've made about people based on their economic status or the work they do. Michael was quiet for a long moment, And what about us? He asked finally. What about our marriage? Victoria felt the weight of the question, understood that her answer would determine not just their future together, but the kind of person she would become going forward. I can't promise to be perfect, she said. I can't undo 3 years of treating Grace badly or erase the prejudices that have shaped me for my entire life. But I can promise to try to be worthy of the forgiveness she offered me today. And I can promise to be worthy of the man I married, the man who defended her when I attacked her, who chose principles over convenience, who showed me what real character looks like. Michael reached across the space between them and took her hand, and Victoria felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something better from the wreckage of her pride. It's going to take time, he said. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair easily. I know, Victoria replied. But Grace taught me something today about forgiveness and second chances. Maybe we can extend the same grace to each other. The next morning, Victoria did something she had never done in 3 years of employing Grace Williams. She got up early and drove to Grace's apartment building. She climbed 3 flights of stairs to a modest 1-bedroom unit and knocked softly on the door. When Grace answered, wearing simple jeans and a sweater instead of her work uniform, Victoria saw her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a maid, but as Grace Williams, a woman of strength and dignity who had every right to look Victoria in the eye as an equal. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace said, surprise evident in her voice. Is everything all right? Grace, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I came to apologize, not just for yesterday, but for 3 years of treating you as if you were invisible. I came to ask for your forgiveness and to tell you that if you're willing to continue working for us, things are going to be different. You're going to be treated with the respect and courtesy you should have received from the first day you walked into our home. Grace studied Victoria's face for a long moment, and Victoria submitted to that examination without flinching, understanding that she was being measured not by her words, but by the sincerity behind them. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace said finally, I've learned that people show you who they really are when they're under pressure. Yesterday, you showed me who you are when you're angry and threatened. But today, you're showing me who you are when you have a choice to make between your pride and your principles. She stepped back from the door, opening it wider in invitation. Would you like to come in and meet my family properly? Grace asked. Marcus is home from the hospital, and Sarah is making breakfast. I think it's time you got to know the people whose lives you've been part of for 3 years. Victoria stepped across the threshold, not just into Grace's modest apartment, but into a new understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy, not in money or possessions, but in the relationships that matter, the love that sustains us, and the character that defines us when everything else falls away. As she sat at Grace's kitchen table, sharing breakfast with Marcus and Sarah, listening to stories of their dreams and struggles, Victoria realized that she was receiving something more valuable than anything her money had ever bought, the chance to be part of something real, something authentic, something built on mutual respect rather than economic transaction. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing lifelong patterns of thought and behavior never is. There would be moments when Victoria would slip back into old assumptions, times when she would have to consciously choose empathy over entitlement, humanity over hierarchy. But sitting in that small kitchen, watching Grace pour coffee with the same care and attention she had always brought to her work, Victoria understood something fundamental about the nature of service and dignity. We are not measured by the work we do, but by the spirit in which we do it. We are not defined by our economic circumstances, but by how we treat others regardless of their circumstances. Grace Williams had spent 3 years showing the Whitmores what true character looked like, even when that character went unrecognized and unappreciated. She had maintained her dignity in the face of indignity, her humanity in the face of dehumanization, her grace in the face of disgrace. And in the end, it was Grace who had taught Victoria the most important lesson of her privileged life, that we are measured not by how we treat those above us in society's hierarchy, but by how we treat those whom society tells us are beneath us. Because in the economy of human worth, there is no hierarchy, only the choice between kindness and cruelty, between seeing others as fellow human beings deserving of respect or as objects to be used for our convenience. Michael had chosen his side, and in doing so, he had chosen the man he wanted to be. Now it was Victoria's turn to make the same choice, not just once but every day, in every interaction, for the rest of her life. The woman who had embarrassed the black maid had learned that true embarrassment comes not from being humiliated in public, but from recognizing the moments when we have failed to live up to our own potential for goodness. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to try again. So there you have it, a story about choices, about character, and about the courage it takes to admit when we've been wrong. Victoria had to confront the ugly truth about her own prejudices and privilege. Michael had to choose between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to his principles. And Grace? Grace showed us what true dignity looks like, even in the face of public humiliation. But here's what I want you to think about. Whose side would you have chosen? Would you have defended your spouse regardless of their actions? Or would you have stood up for what was right, even if it cost you your marriage? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I read every single one, and your perspectives always make me think about these stories in new ways. And remember, if this story moved you, if it made you think about how you treat the people who serve you in your daily life, hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps us continue creating content that doesn't just entertain, but challenges us to be better human beings. Most importantly, join our newsletter using the link in the description. Our newsletter subscribers get access to exclusive inner circle stories like this one, plus deeper psychological analysis of human behavior that we don't share anywhere else. These are the stories that will make you question everything you think you know about motivation, relationships, and what it really means to be a good person. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking, and thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, remember, we are measured not by how we treat those above us, but by how we treat those society tells us are beneath us. Choose kindness. Choose dignity. Choose to see the humanity in everyone you meet. I'll see you in the next story.